August 15th, 1847. Daniel of Charleston. A name scratched from Charleston's records, buried beneath years of shame and silence, but whispered still in the shadows of old plantation houses. It was during the suffocating heat of August 1847 that Daniel, property of the Whitmore estate for 15 brutal years, shattered every chain that bound him, not with escape, but with precision. To the world, Daniel was invisible. Another strong back, another silent face, another body to be bought and sold. He tended the horses with steady hands and kept his head down like all the rest. But Daniel harbored something that could cost him everything: love. His name was Marcus, a field hand with scars that told stories Daniel wished he could erase. They loved in stolen glances across the yard, in brief touches when passing water buckets, in dreams shared during the few moments when the overseer's whip fell silent. The night Master Whitmore discovered their secret, he did what masters always did. He made an example. Marcus was dragged to the center of the quarters and beaten until his breath came in ragged whispers. Then, as Daniel watched helplessly, Whitmore ended Marcus's life slowly, methodically, ensuring every enslaved person understood the price of defying nature's order. What Whitmore didn't know was that night, Daniel didn't plan his escape to freedom. He planned something else entirely. This is the untold story of Daniel of Charleston, the enslaved man who didn't run from his master's cruelty. He returned it, one precise cut at a time. Welcome to Echoes of Truth, where we unearth the stories they never wanted you to hear. I'm talking to the fearless among you, the ones who don't flinch when history shows its true, blood-soaked face. Do you have the courage to hear what really happened in the shadows of Charleston's grand plantations? Hit subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because tonight we're not just uncovering history, we're joining an investigation that the powerful have tried to bury for over 175 years. I want you to picture Charleston in the summer of 1847. The air was a sticky mix of salt from the harbor and sweetness from the sugarcane clinging to every surface. The cobblestone streets echoed with carriages carrying men in pressed linen and women fanning themselves beneath parasols. Yet beneath this genteel facade was a world built on bones and blood, a system that measured human life in ledger lines and coin. At night, the same breeze that carried hymns from church windows also carried muffled cries from the plantations just beyond the city's edge. This was not merely the South, as it was told in polite company. This was Charleston's underbelly, a city balanced on the backs of the enslaved, where silence was currency and cruelty was tradition. And in that silence, a story was brewing, one that could never be written in the public record. Now, you have to understand the master in this story, Richard Harper. To the city of Charleston, Harper was a man of stature, a planter whose sugar fortune afforded him influence and respect. He appeared in church pews on Sundays, dined with local officials, and spoke of Providence as if it sat on his shoulder. But his true power lay not in the sermons he pretended to hear, but in the whip he wielded when no one was watching. To those under his rule, Harper was not a gentleman. He was a shadow that carried cruelty into every corner of their lives. His plantation was more than a place of labor. It was a theater of control, where fear was rehearsed daily and obedience performed under threat of punishment. Respectable in public, monstrous in private, this duality was his mask, and Daniel knew both faces all too well. Let's be real. Every villain wears a costume for the crowd. For Harper, that costume was charity. He spoke of caring for his people, convincing neighbors that his enslaved workers were treated with fairness, even kindness. Visitors were shown tidy cabins, well-fed children, and the songs sung at dusk as proof of harmony on his land. What they never saw were the backs scarred beneath those shirts, the hunger hidden behind practiced smiles, or the fear that pressed silence into every throat. This cover story wasn't just for outsiders. It was a script Harper forced the enslaved to perform on cue, and anyone who forgot their lines knew the consequences. Charleston's polite society bought the illusion because it was easier than admitting what really fueled their prosperity. Easier to believe the play than to face the blood pooling behind the curtain. Beneath the mask of civility, Harper had built a private system of surveillance and punishment. Overseers who doubled as enforcers, informants recruited from among the enslaved, and a shed that looked harmless enough but served darker purposes at night. This was the machine that kept his wealth intact, not the sugar mills, but the fear mills. Daniel worked within this infrastructure, carving wood in the very shed where cries had been silenced hours before. The irony was sharp. A place of creation by day, a place of destruction by night. These dual uses weren't accidental, they were deliberate, a way of reminding the enslaved that even beauty and craft could not escape Harper's shadow. And if anyone dared whisper of injustice, Harper had a ready-made explanation. A lie polished enough to shine under scrutiny, but always hollow inside. When whispers did slip into town, of bruises too deep or screams carried on the wind, Harper leaned on the same excuse that masters across the South perfected: discipline. If a man was seen limping, he was lazy. If a woman bore fresh scars, she was insubordinate. If children cried too long, it was just the summer fever. These explanations were rehearsed so often they began to sound like truths to those who wanted to believe them. And Charleston's authorities? They nodded along, unwilling to question a man whose sugar filled their cups and lined their purses. This was the great silencing. Cruelty disguised as order, suffering explained away as necessity. The oddities were not odd at all. They were the rhythm of Harper's plantation, normalized into invisibility. But no tyrant rules alone. Harper's cruelty needed enablers, and one of them was Josiah, a man enslaved but elevated to the role of overseer's assistant. Now you have to understand Josiah. Survival taught him to serve the master's eye before he served his own people. He kept ledgers of labor, noted absences, and sometimes reported whispers of dissent. To Harper, Josiah was useful. To the others, he was a reminder that betrayal could wear the same chains. Was Josiah a villain, or just a man crushed by fear, forced to trade loyalty for survival? The line blurred. But his presence in this story matters, because when love is hidden in shadows, betrayal always waits nearby with a lantern. The victims in this story were not just Daniel and Samuel, though their love and loss center the tale. Every enslaved man, woman, and child under Harper's rule lived in the theater of cruelty he directed. But Daniel and Samuel bore a unique risk, the risk of love. Samuel, with laughter that softened even the harshest days, carried himself with a quiet defiance that Harper despised. Daniel, skilled with his hands, created beauty from wood, but was forced to hide the tenderness of his heart. Together, they carved out stolen minutes of intimacy, glances, touches, whispers between the cracks of fear. Their love was not weakness, it was resistance, and that resistance made them targets long before Harper ever laid eyes on their secret. Every story like this has a witness. Someone who stumbled upon the truth not meant for their eyes. In this case, it was a young boy, barely 12, sent to fetch tools from the shed late one evening. What he saw was not the quiet work of carving, but the brutal rehearsal of Harper's wrath. He saw Samuel dragged, broken, and left in the dirt. He saw Daniel's eyes, wide with horror but burning with something else, something dangerous. That boy never spoke of it openly, but the image etched itself into his memory, and years later, when whispers spread of what Daniel did in return, it was that boy's memory that gave the whispers weight. This is where the story begins to break free from silence. The boy who had stumbled into Harper's shed that night carried the vision like a brand. He stopped speaking for days, refused to eat, and startled awake at every sudden noise. His mother whispered prayers over him, while his father warned him never to repeat what he saw. Because in Charleston, a child's truth was worth less than a planter's lie. When he did finally speak, when fragments of Samuel's cries tumbled out of his mouth, the adults around him silenced him quickly. "You imagined it," they said. "You're too young to understand." The child's trauma was rewritten as childish fantasy, his terror dismissed as the dreams of a fragile mind. Yet the truth remained etched in him, simmering like an ember. Even in denial, silence only deepened the weight of what he had witnessed. Now you have to understand how Charleston's machinery worked. When a death occurred among the enslaved, there was no outrage, only procedure. A committee of inquiry might appear, but its purpose was not justice. It was maintenance. Maintenance of order, of reputation, of wealth. Harper himself hosted such inquiries with polished ease. Samuel's death, when questioned at all, was recorded as the result of discipline for disobedience. Harper spoke calmly, even mournfully, of his regret at the necessity. Local officials, some of them indebted to him, nodded gravely, accepting his words as fact. No one asked why Samuel's bones had cracked or why his body bore marks of deliberate cruelty, plausible deniability. That was Harper's shield. And Charleston, dependent on men like him, held the shield steady. But truth has a way of seeping through cracks, even when paper and ink erase it. Samuel's death was not the only scar left behind. The men and women who had watched, forced into silence by Harper's command, carried the evidence in their eyes. Their gazes grew darker, their movements slower, their songs quieter. Daniel, most of all. He continued his work in the carving shed, but the toys he shaped grew sharper at the edges, almost violent in their precision. The enslaved community had no courtroom, no audience, but their bodies, their faces, and their silences testified against Harper more loudly than any legal record ever could. They were living evidence of cruelty, altered by the memory of Samuel's broken body. And Daniel, though outwardly obedient, was becoming evidence of something else, a storm gathering beneath the surface. This is where the story gets truly chilling. You see, Harper did not view his cruelty as cruelty. He saw it as method, as control rooted in what he believed to be science. He read treatises that justified violence as necessary correction, that claimed obedience was bred through fear, like a crop through soil. In his journals, fragments preserved long after his death, he described punishment in cold, detached terms: conditioning, reinforcement, removal of defect. To Harper, Samuel's death was not a murder, but an experiment in authority, a proof that love, defiance, or individuality could be beaten into extinction. But what Harper miscalculated was this: experiments yield results, yes, but not always the results you expect. His methodology did not extinguish love. It ignited vengeance. And Daniel, the quiet carver, was sharpening more than just wood. Daniel was not born to rebellion. He was carved into it. For 30 years, he bent his back under the sun, his hands shaping wood into toys for Harper's children, his silence shaping him into a man others mistook for docile. But grief is a sculptor too, and Samuel's death reshaped Daniel into something unrecognizable, even to himself. His love had been ripped from him in front of the very people who shared his chains, and in that moment the mask of obedience cracked. To his community, he became a ghost of sorts, quieter, sharper, a man with eyes that looked through walls. They did not know what he carried inside him, only that something had changed. He was still Daniel the carver, but he was also Daniel the reckoner, and his story was only just beginning. Now you have to understand, Daniel did not strike blindly. He watched, he listened, he studied Harper's routines with the same precision he once used to carve delicate wooden animals. He knew when Harper drank too much, when the overseers grew lax, when Josiah lingered too long near the house. He mapped the plantation in his mind, not as a place of labor, but as a battlefield. Every creak of the floorboards, every placement of a lantern, every key Harper carried on his belt. Daniel noticed them all. In silence, he gathered information the way others gathered hope. He became the plantation's shadow, unseen but ever present. To Harper, Daniel was still invisible. To Daniel, Harper had become nothing more than a man waiting for judgment. This is where I have to pause and ask you directly, can you handle what comes next? Because what Daniel prepared to do is not just an act of defiance. It is an act that even in whispers, generations later, still chills the blood. If you've followed me this far, you've stepped into his world, felt the weight of his grief, and smelled the iron of Samuel's spilled blood in the air. But the night ahead, the night Daniel chose to act, it's the kind of story polite history never wanted you to hear. If you're ready, stay with me, because this is where the tale turns from sorrow to something far darker. Now you have to understand, Daniel's breaking point did not come in a single flash of rage, not in some cinematic explosion of anger, but in a slow, searing realization that ate at him night after night, week after week. He had endured the silence that followed Samuel's death, endured the way the plantation moved forward as though nothing had happened, endured Harper's smug calm, his laughter at dinner, his polished boots clicking across the floorboards as though Samuel's broken body had been nothing more than spilled wine. That silence was heavier than chains, heavier than the whip, because it told Daniel the truth. Samuel's life, his love, his very existence, was worth less than a whisper in Harper's house. Yet silence, left to ferment, becomes a roar. It was one humid night, long after the household had settled into uneasy sleep, that Daniel's grief was hardened into steel. He had been ordered earlier to fetch wood for the hearth, a task he performed countless times without thought. But that night, something shifted. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps it was fate. His steps carried him, almost without his own permission, toward Harper's private study, a room whispered about, rarely entered by anyone outside the master's circle. The door creaked open under his careful hand, and instantly the air struck him, heavy with the sour tang of brandy, the stale bite of tobacco smoke, the suffocating weight of arrogance. In the far corner sat a chest Harper guarded more jealously than his own gold. Daniel's calloused, precise fingers that had carved toys, mended tools, and hidden tears, worked the lock with a small sliver of metal he had shaped long ago. The lid lifted. Inside lay ledgers fat with sugar profits, slave tallies, numbers that turned human lives into neat lines of ink. But beneath them, folded like a secret, lay something far more grotesque. A shirt, Samuel's shirt, torn, stiff with dried blood, preserved not as refuse but as a trophy. Daniel lifted it slowly. The fabric was rough, scratchy, and for a breathless moment he could almost hear Samuel's voice, soft as it had been on those stolen nights when love slipped through the cracks of cruelty. But that echo was drowned by a harsher truth. Harper had not only killed Samuel, he had kept his pain as proof of victory, as if cruelty itself were something to archive and gloat over. Daniel did not weep. He did not crumple. Instead, an uncanny calm filled him. He folded the shirt neatly, placed it back in the chest, and closed the lid with deliberate care. When he lifted his eyes, they were no longer the eyes of a man resigned to silence. They were the eyes of someone who had seen the future written clear. In that study, surrounded by the smell of smoke, greed, and rot, Daniel understood with terrifying clarity that Samuel's death would not remain unanswered. Harper had written the first half of this story. Daniel would write the second, and his pen would not be wood, it would be steel. The night Daniel chose to act was wrapped in storm, as though nature itself conspired to lend him cover. The sky sagged with thunderclouds, swollen and restless, heavy with the promise of violence. The air was thick, damp, and electric, carrying that charged stillness that comes before the heavens split open. The earth beneath his feet seemed to tremble, not from the weather alone, but from something deeper, as if the soil knew it was about to drink blood. Daniel moved like a shadow carved out of the storm. In his hand was no sword, no rifle, nothing grand, only his carving knife, the tool of his trade. The same blade that had once shaped wooden toys for children now gleamed faintly in the dark, sharpened not for play, but for judgment. Inside the big house, Harper was drinking. His voice, booming and careless, rolled down the corridors in drunken song, words slurred but arrogant. His laughter, the sound of a man convinced of his own immortality. The household slept uneasily, aware that Harper's moods could shift like sudden lightning, yet powerless to resist them. But Daniel had not wasted those weeks of silence. He had studied every routine, every stagger in Harper's steps, every corner of the house. This was his moment, the culmination of every night he had lain awake, grief boiling quietly into resolve. He entered through the back door. The hinges groaned softly, the wooden floors whispering creaks beneath his weight. The scent of liquor was thick in the air, sharp and sweet, and with every step, Daniel drew closer to Harper's chamber. His heart was steady, his breath controlled. The storm outside growled like an animal, and he felt its power flowing through him. But fate, or betrayal, struck its blow. Josiah, the overseer's assistant, stirred in the hallway, lantern dangling in his hand. The light caught Daniel's outline, and Josiah's gasp tore through the silence. "Master!" The word was sharp, shrill, splitting the night like a blade. Within moments, chaos erupted. Harper's voice, thick with alcohol but still commanding, roared down the corridor, demanding to know who dared disturb his rest. Daniel fled, not in panic, but in strategy, knife in hand, the storm swallowing him whole. Rain hammered the earth, turning dirt into sucking mud. Lanterns bobbed wildly behind him like furious fireflies. Overseers shouted, dogs barked, the plantation itself waking into a frenzy of pursuit. But Daniel was not running to escape. No. He was leading Harper into the storm, into the open darkness where walls could not protect him. Thunder cracked overhead like war drums, lightning tore the sky into jagged scars, and in those fleeting flashes, Harper glimpsed the truth. Daniel was not prey. He was the hunter. His lungs burned, his muscles screamed, but his will was forged in fire and loss. Each step carried him closer, not to safety, but to reckoning. This was no escape. This was the pursuit inverted, the story rewritten in blood. And Harper, for the first time in his life, was the quarry. By dawn, Charleston's storm had passed, but its fury still clung to the land like a ghost refusing to leave. The trees dripped with heavy rain, their branches sagging under the weight of water. The earth was streaked with mud, cut with tracks of pursuit and flight, the ground itself scarred by the chaos of the night before. The air hung damp and swollen, carrying that unmistakable silence that follows violence, a silence that feels less like peace and more like exhaustion. Harper, nursing bruises and rage, believed the worst had ended. He staggered back to his chamber, muttering curses about runaways, convinced that Daniel, like so many before him, had disappeared into the swamps. That was the script Harper knew. It was the script history expected. Enslaved men ran. Masters pursued. Chains were reforged. Order, however brutal, was restored. But Daniel was not reading from Harper's script. He had no interest in flight. He had no interest in living as a fugitive, hunted through swamps, starved into surrender. His steps led him not away from the big house, but back toward it. Hours later, as the first pale light of dawn slid through the cracks of the window shutters, Harper's chamber door creaked open. The sound was small, but in that early hour, it carried the weight of doom. And there stood Daniel, soaked to the bone, his clothes clung heavy with rain and streaked with mud. His hair dripped water onto the polished floorboards. In his hand, he held his carving knife, not raised in frenzy but gripped loosely, deliberately, as though he had been holding it forever. The silence that filled the chamber was thick, oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic dripping of water onto the floor, like the ticking of a clock counting down the final seconds of Harper's reign. Harper froze. For the first time in his life, he saw Daniel not as property, not as obedient labor, not as an invisible shadow moving silently through his household. He saw him as something else entirely, judge and executioner. This was the reversal no master had prepared for, the moment when centuries of dominance collapsed beneath the weight of one man's resolve. Daniel's eyes did not waver. They burned with pain, yes, and with a grief too vast to ever name aloud. But beneath that grief burned justice, the kind no court would ever grant, the kind that did not require law, the kind that history itself would never dare to acknowledge. Harper's lips parted. Perhaps he reached for prayer, perhaps for bargain, perhaps for some final defense, but words had no place here. In that chamber, With rain dripping like a metronome, Daniel's silence became the loudest sound Harper had ever heard. The reckoning had arrived, and it carried the name of every man and woman who had suffered beneath Harper's hand, every lash, every scar, every broken body. Now, you have to understand. When blood is spilled in silence, the earth remembers, even if men try their best to bury it beneath lies. That storm-soaked night did not vanish with the dawn. It lingered in whispers carried across the slave quarters, in the terrified glances of those who had heard Harper's screams piercing through the storm, in the uneasy quiet of the land itself. The enslaved spoke in hushed tones of Daniel's return to the big house, not as servant, but as specter, moving through the halls with a calm so unearthly it unsettled even the hardened overseers. By morning, panic had spread faster than the rainwater pooling in the dirt. Overseers who had once strutted about with whips in hand now fled to Charleston, their faces pale, their words fractured, muttering of a crime too unnatural to repeat. None dared speak plainly. To name it was to make it real, and none wished to claim ownership of such horror. Charleston's officials did not ride out for justice, nor for compassion. No. They rode out bound by appearances, by duty not to truth, but to reputation. They came to protect Harper's fortune, to preserve the sanctity of his name, and above all, to maintain the illusion of order that kept Charleston's world balanced upon cruelty's knife edge. But when they stepped into that house, their carefully built illusions faltered. What lay before them could not be rewritten into tidy ledgers or polite fictions. Harper's chamber was not a scene of simple violence. It was a statement carved into flesh. The master lay broken, mutilated in a way that robbed him not only of life, but of legacy. His body was no longer that of Charleston's respected planter. It was the body of a man stripped bare, reduced, judged, and sentenced by the very hands he had once claimed to own. Around him, the room told its own story. The brandy glass overturned, its contents staining the argon. Mug papers scattered like fallen leaves, ink smeared where rainwater had seeped in. A trail of wet footprints marked Daniel's path through the house. Steady, deliberate, unhurried. Nothing in that chamber spoke of chaos. Everything whispered of intention. For the first time, Charleston faced a crime that no polite lie could contain, no official ledger could erase. The Chamber of Horrors was not some distant tale from Europe or Africa whispered in travelogues. No, it was here, in the very marrow of their society, exposed under the pale, merciless light of morning. What happened next shook the carefully polished mask of Charleston's elite, a mask they had worn for decades with smug assurance. Harper, the man once paraded in pulpits as a pious benefactor, once toasted at banquets as a pillar of industry and refinement, was now remembered in whispers, not as a titan of sugar, not as a man of God, but as a tyrant undone by his own cruelty. In the days that followed, the whispers grew louder, seeping through drawing rooms, churches, and slave quarters alike. Behind closed doors, neighbors who had long smiled in Harper's presence allowed themselves to confess what they had always suspected. His kindness was a veneer, polished to please the city's elite, while his true wealth was stained not only with the sweat of the enslaved, but with blood, humiliation, and terror. It was a truth too many had chosen to ignore, because acknowledging it meant questioning the very foundation of their society. The overseers, those men who once strutted with whips and pistols under Harper's command, were the first to turn. Their loyalty had never been love. It was survival, dependence, and fear. With their master's corpse cooling in his chamber, they abandoned him with remarkable speed, eager to distance themselves from a name now rotting in scandal. Even Josiah, the collaborator whose voice had betrayed Daniel in the dark hallway, could not hide. The enslaved remembered. They remembered that his cry, "Master," had been the spark that set the night ablaze, the moment that forced Daniel into the storm instead of silence. His treachery had been the thread tugged loose that unraveled everything. And yet, Josiah was spared. He did not feel the whip. He was not cast into the fields or sent to the gallows. Charleston needed him. You see, His survival was not mercy, but strategy. Josiah became useful, a living mouthpiece to retell the story the city wished to, believe. He repeated the version polished for the papers. Harper, the noble master, cut down by an unhinged slave. It was a narrative that smoothed over decades of brutality, that erased Samuel's broken body, that disguised the truth Daniel had carved into Harper's flesh. But to the enslaved, no ink was required to write the truth. They carried it in memory, in scar, in silence. They had seen Samuel's suffering, Harper's mask slip, and Daniel's eyes burn with something larger than vengeance. Harper's unmasking, then, was not merely the destruction of his reputation, it was the unveiling of his victims, their suffering, their dignity, their humanity, if only in the quiet, forbidden spaces where Charleston's powerful dared not look. This is where the story grows wider than Charleston itself, and you have to understand, Harper was never an island. His power, his wealth, his illusion of respectability were threads woven into a web that stretched far beyond the humid fields of South Carolina. His plantation fed into a machine that spanned oceans. Ships departed Charleston's ports, heavy with barrels of sugar and casks of rum, cargo purchased with human misery and sold for dazzling profits in London drawing rooms, Parisian cafes, and New York counting houses. Behind every sweet spoonful, behind every toast raised with fine liquor, lingered the shadow of broken bodies bent over cane fields. Harper was one link in a chain, but the chain stretched across continents, binding together merchants, bankers, insurers, and politicians who all pretended their hands were clean while pocketing blood-stained coin. So when Harper's death came, brutal, humiliating, unforgettable, it posed a threat larger than one man's reputation. To admit the truth of what happened in that chamber would mean lifting the veil not only on Harper's cruelty, but on the entire structure that had enabled him. It would force London merchants to acknowledge that their riches were baptized in Charleston's blood. It would force New York bankers to see their ledgers not as neutral ink, but as accomplices to slavery's terror. It would force Washington's politicians, those great orators of liberty, to admit their prosperity was mortgaged against the backs of enslaved men and women. None of them could allow that reckoning. And so, the story was rewritten. Charleston's papers reported not of justice, not of vengeance, not of the slow unraveling of a tyrant, but of slave savagery. Daniel was painted as unhinged, dangerous, a beast driven by madness rather than a man driven by love, grief, and justice. The tale was reshaped into a weapon, a cautionary story meant to terrify the enslaved into obedience and reassure the powerful of their place. But beneath that polished narrative, whispers moved like wildfire. In taverns thick with smoke, in churches where hymns rose like fragile defiance, in hidden corners of abolitionist meetings, Daniel's name spread. He was not spoken of as mad, he was remembered as necessary, a man who had reached into the heart of a system thought untouchable, and left a scar it could never fully hide. Because you see, the scope of the crime was never about a single plantation or a single master's cruelty. It was global, rooted in silence and profit. Daniel's act, though erased from ledgers, became a crack in that silence. And once a crack forms, the structure can never be trusted again. Let's be real. Charleston could not afford to let Daniel's story stand as it was. The city itself was balanced on a fragile illusion, the idea that masters were unshakable, that control was absolute, that the enslaved could be broken into silence forever. But Harper's death, delivered not by sickness or accident, but by the hands of the man he had once owned, shattered that illusion like glass. If one enslaved man's grief could transform into vengeance, if one night could topple a master's legacy, then the question hung heavy in every parlor, every market, every prayer meeting. What might others do? Fear is contagious, and Harper's death was not simply an act of violence. It was a contagion of possibility. And so, Charleston reached for its oldest weapon: silence. The newspapers carried reports of an incident at the Harper estate, carefully stripped of detail, reduced to whispers of disturbance and regrettable tragedy. No mention of Samuel, no mention of cruelty, no mention of justice carved into flesh. Church leaders thundered from pulpits, their sermons booming about the dangers of rebellion, the snares of sin, and the need for obedience. Yet not one of them named the true sin: Harper's sadism, his arrogance, his murder of a man who dared to love. From the very top of Charleston society, down to the patrols stalking its streets, an order was enforced. Daniel's name was not to be spoken. His story was not to be remembered. Lips that dared utter it would be struck with the whip. Even in abolitionist circles, where one might expect defiance, the story of Daniel was handled with trembling care. Pamphlets aimed at swaying Northern hearts relied on appeals to morality, to the innocence of suffering families. Daniel's vengeance was too raw, too bloody, too incendiary. It did not fit their polished narratives. And so even among supposed allies, the silence thickened. But silence, as always, has cracks. In hymns sung low in the quarters, in small wooden carvings hidden beneath floorboards, in knowing glances exchanged under moonlight, Daniel's name survived. Officially, he was erased. On paper, he had never lived, never loved, never avenged. But unofficially, he became something more dangerous than memory. He became legend, and legends do not die when paper burns. They live where silence cannot reach. What became of the players in this shadowed drama? Harper's end, though violent and intimate, did not strip him of the pomp and ritual that Charleston demanded for its dead. His body was interred with ceremony, the coffin polished to a shine that belied the horrors of the night before. His epitaph, carved in careful, gilded letters, was a story of virtue, of philanthropy, of a man devoted to God and community. The city mourned a pillar of society, its residents nodding solemnly, pretending not to see the jagged scars left behind by his tyranny, pretending not to recall the whispers that told of a master undone by his own cruelty. Public memory was rewritten with the precision of a surgeon, erasing the blood while leaving the bones of respectability intact. Josiah, the collaborator whose treachery had set chaos into motion, survived, but survival was no blessing. He never thrived, never regained the respect he had once craved. Among the enslaved, he was marked for life, a man whose voice had betrayed his own people, whose fear had tipped the scales of vengeance. He lived long enough to see freedom arrive in fits and starts, to see the shackles loosen on others, but he could never escape the weight of his own choices. Each glance from those who remembered Daniel's courage, each quiet nod in passing, reminded him of the night his loyalty had cost another man his life, and perhaps sealed his own moral ruin. The overseers scattered like frightened birds. Some found work on distant plantations, carrying Harper's legacy of fear with them, whispering of the screams that haunted the big house. Others disappeared entirely, swallowed by obscurity, their names fading like mist, leaving behind only the memory of complicity and terror. And Daniel, officially, he vanished. The authorities had no body, no confession, no ledger entry to pin him down. Some whispered he had been captured and hanged in secret, his corpse buried where no one would ever find it. Others swore he escaped entirely, living under new names, moving from Charleston to Georgia, then to New Orleans. The story of his courage and vengeance whispered quietly between enslaved communities, spreading like fire through the South. The truth of his fate remains uncertain, almost purposefully so. And yet, in a way, it does not matter, because Daniel lived on, not merely in body but in memory, in legend, in the stories passed in hushed tones by those who had witnessed what one man dared to do. He became more than a man. He became a symbol, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, even beneath centuries of oppression, vengeance, courage, and justice could ignite like lightning, leaving a scar that no empire could erase. The legacy of Daniel's act lingers like smoke after a fire, curling into corners, drifting through generations, impossible to fully disperse. To the enslaved who lived under the constant weight of chains, whips, and fear, Daniel became more than a man. He was proof that the structures built to dominate and dehumanize could be challenged, that cruelty was not untouchable, and that pain, when wielded with purpose, could become a kind of power. Whispers of his defiance spread quietly, like secret embers passing from one mouth to another, igniting hope in hearts long bent by oppression. In hushed tones, in hidden carvings, in stories murmured between families, Daniel's courage became a blueprint for imagination and resistance. To Charleston's elite, however, he was a warning. A nightmare materialized, flesh and blood confronting the illusion of permanence. He exposed vulnerabilities that no ledger, sermon, or polite lie could cover. Harper's death and Daniel's act were more than an isolated event. They were a crack in the facade of an entire society, a reminder that control was never absolute, that fear could be turned against its masters. And as the story traveled beyond Charleston, through rumor, through legend, through the cautious recounting of abolitionist circles, it unsettled those who would rather forget, those who depended on silence to preserve their power. And to us, looking back through the fog of history, Daniel is something even more complicated. Was he a murderer or a man enacting a justice that no law would provide? Was he consumed by vengeance, or was he simply delivering the sentence written on Samuel's scarred body, etched into every lash, every hidden tear, every stolen embrace that had been denied by cruelty? The moral is not clean. It is jagged, unsettling, resistant to simple judgment. Perhaps it was never meant to be neat. Perhaps the story exists precisely to disturb us, to force recognition that love in a time of unrelenting cruelty is itself an act of rebellion, and that rebellion always carries a cost. The world tried to erase Daniel, to scrub him from ledgers, from papers, from polite memory. But in the very act of erasure, he became unforgettable. His legacy is not merely the violence he carried out, but the truths it revealed. That beneath every empire built on suffering lies the seed of reckoning. That beneath every master's mask lies the fragility of human consequence. Daniel's story endures, not as comfort, but as a warning, a whisper, and a testament to the courage that can emerge even in the darkest shadows. And so, I leave you with a question. Could something like this happen today? Could a single act of courage, of vengeance, of love turned into defiance, unsettle the fragile illusions that hold our own society together? Would we even see it coming, or would we, like Charleston's polite elite, convince ourselves that the mask was real, that the order we trust is unbreakable, until the moment arrives and it is far too late? Daniel's story is not merely a tale of the past. It is a mirror held up to every era, reflecting silence, complicity, and the dangerous comfort we find in believing the lies that make us feel safe. Every empire built on oppression relies on forgetting, on erasing the inconvenient, on smoothing over the cracks that could expose the rot beneath. And yet, history has always been written by those who fear men like Daniel the most, by those who wish the story would stay buried, unspoken, unremembered. Here, on Echoes of Truth, we do something different. We give breath to the silences. We name the names they tried to erase, and we remind ourselves that the past is never truly gone. Daniel may have been fictionalized, his story reconstructed from whispers, imagination, and the faint traces of injustice, but his legacy, the idea of resistance, of vengeance, of courage in the face of tyranny, resonates as if it were carved into the very bones of history. If you've walked this far with me through Charleston's storm, through the halls of Harper's house, and into the minds and hearts of those who witnessed what one man dared to do, then you are part of the circle now. You are among the seekers who refuse to turn away, who insist on peering behind the mask, who understand that truth is often buried in shadows. Subscribe. Share this story. Tell me where you're listening from, because the investigation does not end here. The echoes continue, and the next story beckons. Soon, we will travel north to a small New England town where whispers of a family curse did not fade with superstition or old folk tales, but ended in blood upon the floor of the church. The dark corners of history are never empty, and in them lie truths both chilling and profound. Stay with me. Darkness leaves echoes, and together we follow them. We trace the paths others are too afraid to walk. We uncover what others have tried to bury. And we remember, because those who are forgotten still have a voice, if only we dare to listen.